Do you ever find yourself saying yes when you're screaming no inside, or feel like your boundaries have more holes than Swiss cheese? You're not alone. You have been conditioned to believe choosing others over yourself is the norm, not the exception. That being a yes person is an ideal trait, and that a boundaryless existence is both feasible and admirable. But where has it gotten you? Knee-deep in negative self-talk and incapable of asserting your needs without feeling an exorbitant amount of shame and guilt. But what if I told you this doesn't have to be your norm moving forward? What if instead you could learn how to tolerate the distress of saying no? That you could learn to set boundaries and see them as invitations, not disappointments. And that you could stop taking responsibility for other people's emotional states. How? Let's dive headfirst into the concept of assertive communication, where you'll learn how to stop being everyone's doormat and start expressing your needs without turning into a megaphone. Let's get your voice heard, loud and clear, without the shame. Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Kira Wackett. Thanks for joining me for another video as we work to empower and equip you with the confidence and skills to write your own story so that you can live your life on purpose. Today we're talking communication, assertive communication. But before we dive into the topic, I wanted to make sure you knew that my Fall Liberated Living course is open. So if you are ready to dive deep into the work of shame resilience with a small group of people working towards those same goals, sign up today. Space is limited to just 8 people, and I only run it 2 times a year, so sign up before the spaces are filled. All right, now let's talk communication. Communication is crucial in all aspects of life, yet many of us struggle because we've never been taught the skills or given the permission to express ourselves effectively. This applies not only to how we communicate with others, but with ourselves too. We've heard the term assertive before, but for many of us, we still don't quite know what that means or how to put it into practice. Assertive communication is about being able to communicate from a place of openness and honesty, making space for your thoughts and feelings to be heard while also holding space for others. It's about speaking from a place of respect and inclusion, and it's not about one-upping the other person or feeling a sense of competition between you. It's about speaking from a place free from shame, blame, and judgment, and maintaining boundaries of what is and isn't within your scope of responsibility. Now, in short, I think about assertive communication as the key to allowing everyone to feel seen, safe, and heard. But assertive communication is just one of 4 main types of communication and can be really difficult to shift to for some of us, like me, when we fall into these other 3 forms of communication: passive, passive-aggressive, and aggressive. So before we talk about how to be more assertive, let's get clear on what these other forms are and maybe where you fall and identify. So passive communicators assume a role of subservience. They are people pleasers through and through, or those who lose themselves in accommodating others. I think about this style of communication as one where we stand in the shadows to ensure there's light for everyone else. This form of communication colludes with shame and leaves us feeling perpetually less than. Passive-aggressive communicators are where you appear to be passive, but use subtle, indirect, and often anger-driven tactics to make others feel hurt or less than. Now, my family has a 9th degree black belt in passive-aggressive communication. I think about it as being able to hold on to any tidbit of information and unleashing it whenever you need to take away someone's power or assert power over others. Now, passive-aggressive communicators often want to avoid conflict, so they don't directly address the issues at hand. But without resolve, these issues build pressure under the surface, and that erupts in ways that leave others in the shadow. Now, aggressive communicators are communicators who use shame and anger as their primary communication tools. They create shade for others and use these tools to try and force themselves more into the light. This is also rooted in shame and is usually from a need to push people away or try and obtain some position of power over others to feel more secure about themselves. The key difference between assertive communication and each of these 3 is that assertiveness is responsive. It allows you to acknowledge emotions without letting them overwhelm the conversation. In the case of passive, passive-aggressive, or aggressive communication, we aren't responding, but instead react from a place of emotion and displaced power in the hands of our shame and or the other party. Now, when we're here, we fall into patterns of mind reading, predicting outcomes, or becoming defensive, which leaves us feeling lonely, resentful, and dominated by shame. Now, I have a powerful video that breaks down this concept of reacting versus responding. So I'm going to have that in the show notes for you. Make sure you check that out after this video. And as you dive deeper into unraveling your communication tactics and relearning some of these new ones. Now, it's important to note that all of us, even the most assertive people, can get stuck in these other three forms of communication. We're humans, not robots. Naming and recognizing these other forms is about giving yourself space to reflect and grow. This is how we learned to communicate, how we coped, what we saw, what we knew. And it worked. In some ways, temporarily, it's just not working anymore. But we can't just dump on all these communication styles, as all this does is create shame and judgment towards ourselves and others. Instead, let's think about how these styles may limit you from creating a life that isn't overrun by shame and negative core beliefs. See, each of these three styles directly correlates with what has been deemed the shame defenses or strategies for disconnection. Now, I dive into this a bit more in a couple of my awesome podcast episodes, so I do have a link for some of those in the show notes. But that being said, each of these styles of communication ultimately leads to a greater sense of disconnection, as their purpose is to protect us from being abandoned or seen by prematurely putting distance between us and those around us. So now let's talk a little bit about where our style of communication comes from, both to build insight, but also some empathy for ourselves and for others. Now, like most things in life, we develop our communication at a very early age, from both direct and indirect experiences. The influence of others' communication styles, responses you received when trying out different communication styles, and overall awareness of communication lays a clear foundation. This then becomes complicated by cultural norms, implicit biases, the context of our communication experiences, and ultimately our core beliefs. How should a woman talk? What perceptions do people have of someone who's in a bigger body? When have we been assertive but it's been perceived as aggressive? What tones do people associate with being angry, bossy, abrasive, or scary? What we see and experience leads us to develop response tactics and defenses to arm ourselves against potential threats in the future. And with shame as a guiding force in almost all we do, we're also trying to develop a style of communication that best protects us from being found out or abandoned. So I want to talk then a little bit about if this is where this comes from, and these are the styles we do. Again, let's build another layer of empathy. Why then is assertive communication so challenging to get to? Now, the biggest barrier is our wiring. Our brain has become hardwired to communicate and respond to the world in a certain way. Over time, the more fear, shame, bias, and core beliefs influence our communication, the harder it is to interrupt the cycle, and it becomes automatic. Not to mention, change is hard. Not only because of the internal barriers, like our brain, but because of the external barriers as well. People get used to us communicating in a certain way, and changing our communication style can throw others off, especially if in the past they've benefited from this other form of communication. Plus, assertive communication forces you to come face to face with ambiguity. At least with passive, passive-aggressive, or assertive communication, we could anticipate the outcome. Now the results are unknown, and it's out of our control how others will respond. And we all know how much our fear brain loves that. And finally, because it takes time, with so many of us wanting and expecting a quick fix, it becomes hard to trust that this will pay off in the long run to do this type of work, to rewire our brain and our communication styles, especially during those times of transitional distress. So why do we need to work on it? Why should you care? Because it allows us to directly confront our shame narratives and process unresolved emotions and distress. We can see ourselves independent of others and root ourselves in our values, ideals, and goals without succumbing to or defending against the beliefs or responses of others. We can speak from a place of openness without assuming someone else's reactions, feelings, or needs, and trust that they will communicate from their own space and place themselves. And honestly, because whatever we've been doing isn't serving us, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And we owe it to ourselves to be seen fully and to hold space for others as well. Okay, now that we have a bit of buy-in, we've gotten some more insight, some more empathy, hopefully, let's talk about the big question. How do we actually do it? Remember, any sustainable change takes both insight and time. We must first learn more about our shame narratives and communication styles before we can enact long-lasting change. And while you're working on that larger component, here are a few small tips and tricks that you can do to help start moving you in that direction of assertive communication, so that you're at least seeing some micro shifts that will support you to do those bigger shifts overall. First, get to know your self-talk voice. Before we can work on how we communicate with others, we need to learn how we communicate with ourselves. So I want you to take 5 to 10 minutes and write down all of the thoughts that have been running through your head today. What have you said to yourself when you looked in the mirror, left your meeting, checked your to-do list? Now read it. How many of your self-evaluations and thoughts are negative? And honestly, how many of them are opinions? If we talk down to and judge ourselves, it's going to affect the way we communicate with those around us as well. Second, use I statements. Now, I know this sounds corny, but this is one of the best tools you can use and one of the very few things from middle school that I still have in my back pocket. When we're communicating with someone else, we can only speak from our own perspectives. When you did X, I felt Y. I felt like garbage when you asked me to blank. Or I think or I feel Y. Phrases like you did or you made me feel give all the power and blame and responsibility to the other person. We don't make space for intention and perception, and we forgot to acknowledge both parties' experiences. This is also true in instances where we let others speak for us or over us as well. So instead, I want you to speak from a place of what you know to be true for you and allow the possibility of a different narrative for the other party. This doesn't mean you're right or wrong. It just means we all experience interactions differently. We can both stand in the light without casting shadows on each other. Third, ask yourself, whose responsibility is this? Too often, we assume a responsibility for other people's feelings, actions, and beliefs. We take on a role that isn't ours and become resentful and overwhelmed. Check in with what reactions, issues, feelings, behaviors, or thoughts are your responsibility and relinquish the others. Now, I have a link in the show notes to a video I did a few weeks ago about rethinking our relationship with control and helping you break down what is and ultimately isn't in your control. Sometimes people are going to be upset about what we say. That doesn't mean we need to fix it. Sometimes we're going to feel backed into a corner, bullied, or like we have to take on the role of making others happy or to fix their pain. That doesn't mean that it's helpful to do so or that we need to. Next, use the and versus but technique. Many of you have heard me talk about this skill before, and if you haven't, I have a link to a video in the show notes that takes you much deeper on this topic. But in short, it's one of my best weapons against shame and conflict. It's important we make space for both parties and for all aspects of the story or conversation. As soon as we use the word but, we negate part of it. The other person, our feelings, our ask. So instead, I want you to replace but with and. I know you didn't intend to hurt my feelings when you said X, and you did. You've done really well this quarter working on your sales goals, and there are some opportunities to continue growing in the next quarter that I'm excited about. Now, it sounds simple, and yet it is one of the most effective techniques. Remove the emotional defenses and allow for both possibilities. Celebrate wins and see opportunities for growth. Acknowledge intention and hold space for perception or effect. And finally, act as if. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they use this phrase, fake it till you make it, which is very similar to this therapeutic concept. Remember, it takes a long time for our brain to rewire itself to new communication styles or forms of interaction. And with shame and fear lurking at every corner, it's not an easy process. That being said, it'll take a long time for you to establish and grow confidence in that skill. And we don't want to wait until that time to allow ourselves the opportunity to practice these skills. So in this technique, your job is to play the role of someone who has no problem being assertive. Act as if you've done this before and you know it's going to go well. Assume an outcome and play the role as if it's already happened. I mean, you've been doing that anyways, you've just been assuming a negative outcome. This technique allows you to move from motivation to follow through without feeling overwhelmed by your thoughts and self-doubt. Now, by no means are these steps alone going to make you feel like you've mastered assertive communication. Assertive communication is an iterative process of insight building and meaningful and sustainable change making to shift out of those more defensive communication patterns. And trust me, action alone won't get you there. You have to spend that time getting to know your shame, your core beliefs, to consider why you react the way you do in situations, because it ultimately connects to your beliefs about yourself and your fears about judgment and rejection. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. This community is here to support you, and if you're ready for more than that, then click the links below to join my upcoming Liberated Living program or set up a consult call to learn more about different ways that we could work together to support you in this process. As always, be sure to take some time and reflect on what you're leaving here or taking with you from today's episode, and leave it in the comments. Now, if you found this video valuable and insightful, I encourage you to hit that thumbs up, click subscribe, and of course, share this video with someone that you think could benefit from hearing it. I appreciate so much the opportunity to get to be here with all of you on your shame resilience journey. Remember, you have the right to author your own story. So let's go get that pen back. I'll see you next time.